Okay, guys, we are back with the second installment of our conversation about Kant's religion within the bounds of mere reason alone. Our first installment primarily concerned with trying to do some roughshod definitions that might be helpful as we progress. I know that they will be helpful, but they are fluid. And I think right now, we kind of need to start going line by line, trying to understand how Kant builds towards his ultimate thesis. So let's get to it. So Kant starts off the section, what does it mean to orient oneself in thinking, by talking about how we must abstract up from sensibility with our concepts. He says they will always be appended to image representations. So what did you think that meant, Matt?
So for the concepts of reason can't act on themselves. We can't learn anything from the concepts themselves. We need the content of the things we're experiencing in the world.
What do you mean by they can't act on themselves? Sorry to get so to cross-examine you here so much, but I think it'll be important. Because the thing is like, the concepts are not derived from experience, right?
Right. No.
These are things that are inbuilt, right?
They're the tools to order experience. And the problem with reason for Kant is reason in some ways gets carried away when it tries to count as knowledge those things which reason comes up with through concepts alone. Which was one of his critiques of Mendelssohn, was the idea that Mendelssohn could prove anything metaphysically or theologically from speculative reason or conceptual reason alone, without representations from experience, without the knowledge that comes through experience. That's really the critique of reason that Kant begins with, even in his first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason. The problem of he critiques metaphysics because metaphysics is making a lot of claims about a lot of things that you can't get from everyday empirical experience. It's just running away with all sorts of different ideas, whether those ideas are ideas about spiritual beings in the world, for instance. Mm-hmm. Like, you're not getting that from sensible life, from sensible experience, from empirical experience. You're getting that from reason, speculative reason on its own running amok.
So the way that I read this, and this could be totally erroneous, but the way I'm trying to understand this is that, like, we can unearth the concepts that are being applied to intuitions in order to form our reality. Like, we can investigate phenomena and see that there are these concepts that are being applied there and know that they are intrinsically within us. But then, like, if we sort of isolate those pure concepts, we can then create sort of general rules, conceptual rules that allow us to do logic, right? And allow us to do certain sort of heuristic things, such as postulate that there may be a God and a soul and stuff like that. It doesn't seem like to me that the idea of God and the immortality of the soul is implanted in the mind of man in the same way, say, as the other things that are just basically there for carving up reality. And the more that we abstract from sensibility, the more we get to these concepts that can't be proven, yet we entertain anyway, such as God. Is that how am I reading Kant right? I mean, am I echoing him, or do you think what I'm saying is wrong?
Well, I wouldn't say that about... That might be true. If we're claiming that, if we're talking about God, immortality of the soul, and freedom and things like that, then I don't think, because Kant has an explanation for why those things arise. They still arise from reason, from practical reason, but they can't arise.
You don't think they arise theoretically? Or is it purely practically? Like, if man wasn't a moral creature, would he ever entertain the notion of God?
If man wasn't a moral creature, if man didn't have reason,
well, of course he wouldn't be. Of course, those concepts wouldn't arise if man didn't have reason. But can you even talk about rationality and morality as being separable? Right?
Right. I guess I'm trying to think of when theoretical reason is making claims about God, immortality of the soul, or freedom. Sure, it's problematic. It's problematic, and I guess we need to distinguish too theoretical reason and practical reason.
Because I'm reading him here as saying that we can get to theoretical concepts of God through abstraction up from sensibility, but that they're ultimately going to remain impotent, and then you have practical reason kick in, so that then we enter into some sort of postulation where we can believe without knowing in God or something like that. And so you can theoretically hypothesize about God, and then you can morally postulate God in a practical sense. So it seems to be twofold as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I guess I wanted to make sure that distinction between being able to know versus what he calls the need of reason giving rise to the idea of God.
Which is a very strange idea to talk about reason having needs, and what exactly that means. And how exactly it leads to there being a rational sort of faith.
Yeah.
So what's interesting here, maybe this quote that I'll read from page 3 of the Cambridge edition will get us onto the next subject. The maxim that it is necessary to orient oneself in the speculative use of reason by means of a certain guideline, which sometimes called common sense or healthy reason and sometimes plain understanding. So ultimately, we've danced around this all before, the practical reason is ultimately going to lead us back to some sort of tradition, maybe even some sort of revelation, maybe not. All that like the speculative and the pure sort of reason can do is clarify the concepts. So earlier we were going through the different terms and stuff like that, and we're trying to figure out what are the attributes of God or whatever. The only thing that our theoretical reason would be able to do is to make sure that there wasn't something contradictory about the concept of God theoretically.
Right.
But beyond that, I'm not really sure what theoretical reason can do.
Yeah, it can't claim to know something.
Right.
Like, and that's Kant's big point here, is you can't claim to know about God. That idea of what knowledge can and can't be. Knowledge needs to be based in sensible experience.
Okay. So on page 4, he says, in orienting oneself, Kant wants to know the maxims healthy reason uses in working on its cognition of supersensible objects. And we spoke earlier, he's going to sort of extrapolate. We spoke earlier, he's going to talk about there being this subjective ground of guidance or understanding or something. We talked about this, how there's this subjective understanding of space, of knowing the right from the left that helps us use compasses and figure out where we are to go in the horizon, east, west, north, south. And this allows us to get around, and this allows us to sort of make mathematical understanding. It gets us to the point where we can do math and physics and everything like that. But let's see. Even when there's like no intuition, we can still sort of orient ourselves in like empty space. Yeah. So I'm going to read a quote here from pages 5 and 6, and maybe this will help us get to the next section. For then it is no longer in a position to bring its judgments under a determinate maxim according to objective grounds of cognition. But solely to bring its judgments under a determinate maxim according to a subjective ground of differentiation in the development of its own faculty of judgment. I guess what I take him to be saying here is it ought not to be strange to us for there to be subjective grounds that guide reason.
Yeah.
If knowing our right from our left allows us to get around geographically, mathematically, within physics and stuff like that, if we're going to admit that as a way that we can properly orient ourselves in the world, maybe we shouldn't find it so strange that we would have other subjective intuitions that would guide us in the moral and religious dimensions. That's how.
Yes.
I think the whole reason why he goes into that is to normalize this move to postulate God and the immortality of the soul.
Right.
Is that how you read that?
Yeah, and you notice though that again, this subjective means, carrying on page 6, this subjective means still remaining as nothing other than reason's feeling of its own need.
All right, so let's talk about that subjective feeling of reason's need. Okay? Like, what exactly is going on there? He says something along, this is paraphrasing him, but he says something along the lines of, what if reason has a need to judge, yet we are limited by ignorance of our factors necessary for making a judgment? Like, we don't have the intuitions to determine there's God and immortality of the soul, but there's like reason has very real needs for there being a God. And, we have to talk about what some of those needs are. I mean, we've hinted at it a little bit in our sort of our makeshift glossary of terms that we'll improve on throughout the seminar. But how do you understand? I mean, if I can throw it back to you for a second as I compile my thoughts, how do you understand that subjective need of reason?
The subjective need of reason.
Well, one of them he says something to the effect of is like, look, we can't make. He's like, if we don't like think of there being something super sensible, like we can't really make sense of our very experience of the world in general. On page 6, he says, but now there enters the right of reason's needs as a subjective ground for presupposing and assuming something which reason may not presume to know through objective grounds, and consequently for orienting itself in thinking solely through reason's own need in that immeasurable space of the sensible, for which for us is filled with dark night. Right? And just a little further on page 7, because I think this will bring it out.
Yeah.
It is quite otherwise with the concept of a first original being as a supreme intelligence and at the same time as the highest good. For not only does our reason already feel a need to take the concept of the unlimited as the ground of all limited beings, hence of all other things, but this need even goes as far as the presupposition of its existence, without which one can provide no satisfactory ground at all for the contingency of the existence of things in the world, let alone for the purposiveness and order which is encountered everywhere in such a wondrous degree.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I hear him saying there is that the mind is sort of naturally, subjectively led to the presupposition of the existence of God, given what sort of teleological order it sees in the world.
Yeah.
Even though that is not objectively provable.
Yeah. The need for purpose. Again, this is highlighted on page 8. That the issue of we cannot prove the impossibility of such a purposiveness apart from an intelligent cause.
Right.
And yet there remains a sufficient ground for assuming such a cause in reason's need to presuppose something intelligible in order to explain this given appearance, since nothing else with which reason can combine any concept provides a remedy for this need.
Right.
So it becomes an issue of remedying the need for purposiveness, basically, for purpose.
Right.
For some type of reason to keep going. I mean, that's he talks about something similar with the immortality of the soul. Like, we have this need to continually morally improve. Therefore, we must continually morally improve forever.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting here, and we talk about this need of reason, and shortly after we get to this need of reason, he's going to bifurcate it and say that the need of reason is twofold. He's going to talk about it as being theoretical and practical. And perhaps we can say a little bit, I skipped this in our first installment when we got to the terms conditioned and unconditioned, and maybe we can define it after examining these quotes from page 8. So he talks about the theoretical need of reason, and he says this: we must assume the existence of God if we want to judge about the first causes of everything contingent. Okay, so I guess that is going to be the theoretical aspect of that, and maybe in relief in contrast to the practical, we can understand what is conditioned about that. And then the practical is unconditioned for some reason. We'll have to see what that means. We are necessitated to presuppose the existence of God not only if we want to judge, but because we have to judge. Okay, so let's break that down. Like, it's a pretty important distinction, I think. So when he says it is a theoretical need of reason to presuppose God, to say that there's a cause of everything contingent, like, that's just to make logical sense of the world, right? There's not like a moral dimension to that. Like, it's just like, how does something exist rather than nothing, right? Like, there's no like moral dimension of that that's forcing us to judge that. It's just like, how can we possibly like tell up from down, right from left, east to west, if there's like a universe with no creator, right? It's just a merely sort of, it's quasi-logical. But I guess the question is, what's conditioned about it? Like, why would he call that a conditioned need of reason? Why do you think he calls it a conditioned need? Why is the theoretical need of reason conditioned? Is it a condition? Is it a condition because of our need to make sense of the world? We may have to come back to that, and that's okay. We don't have to have all the answers right now. But he says, and then to bring it out, he says the practical presupposition, or the practical need. Again, on page 8, he says, we are necessitated to presuppose the existence of God not only if we want to judge, but because we have to judge. We have to judge. Why do we have to judge? And I think this will come out later, but I think what he's trying to say here is we have to judge that there is like a God and immortality, or otherwise like our moral striving will like fall apart. Like if we don't do this, we won't will the good will.
Yeah.
That's how I understand the difference between the practical need and the theoretical need. What do you think?
No, I agree with you, but again, I'm still stuck on the conditioned unconditioned part. Like I'm still unsure. So
well, the distinction may be arbitrary. He may just throw it in there to further distinguish it. We may be getting caught up in the jargon a little bit. I don't know. I mean, I could take some educated guesses, but I think that's all they would be at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's not trouble ourselves too much about it. I think that would be getting too mired in the details. So, he says this interesting. He has this interesting quote on page 8, which I think will be productive in our conversation. In regards to and we talked about in the introduction, we talked about the moral law, the categorical imperative, and how this ultimately gives everybody autonomy, because reason is determining a moral behavior, not cultural norms, not a king, not pleasure, but reason itself. It's disinterested, right? He says on reason's moral law precepts, the idea of the highest good possible in the world insofar as it is possible only through freedom, morality. From the other side, these precepts lead to what depends not merely on human freedom, but also on nature, which is the greatest happiness insofar as it is apportioned according to the first. Okay, let's read that again. The idea of the highest good possible in the world insofar as it is possible only through freedom, morality. From the other side, these precepts lead to what depends not merely on human freedom, but also on nature, which is the greatest happiness, insofar as it is apportioned according to the first. So I think what he's saying here is that our very nature has it built within it to say that happiness has to be distributed in accordance with moral performance.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And that would really fit with his with some of his views about his practical philosophy as well. That happiness arises after the fact of the moral feeling arises after moral feeling arises after the fact of having done the correct moral thing. We don't do it for that feeling, but it does arise after having done the morally right thing.
Right. And so, and we mentioned this earlier, in order for there to be this, because like the world is such that it's not going to distribute happiness in accordance with virtue.
Yeah.
That it's going to require the postulation of God from a practical side. Practical reason is going to require the postulation of God and immortality, so our moral striving will be judged and rewarded one day.
Yeah. Right?
So then, and I've raised this question before, and perhaps I'm being a bit repetitious. Like we have to try to. We're gonna have, and you look. This is something a lot of commentators of Kant have done in trying to get their mind around it. Is how Kant can, and maybe let's take that up as a discussion question. Okay, how Kant can make these postulates without corrupting the thing that is ultimately supposed to be driving morality, which is desire for our own freedom in accordance with rationality. So, I guess what I'm trying to say here is, how would it be possible for him to have his cake and eat it too here? How can we be rationally determined organisms that care nothing but for our own freedom, but then go through the back door and slip in God and virtue? And maybe he takes up this critique later on, but in this opening salvo, it doesn't seem to be too much of a concern to him.
Right.
I mean, do you think that's conceivable to originally be motivated to be a good person, but then after the fact graft on the postulations of immortality and God?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's possible. Because I'm not a Kantian, I'm not sure I agree with... I tend to relate more to... We were talking in part one about people like Jacobi or even Weisenman. And because I tend to relate more with Weisenman, and the issue of the separation of reason from revelation, like this idea that God can arise from... that the idea of God arises from morality itself as a need of morality after the fact. I'm not sure if it's true or if it's just Kant wanting to have his cake and eat it too. Yeah. To escape charges of atheism as well and of fatalism, but wanting to keep it all within trying to keep all those factors within reason itself. I mean, it's clever. It's super clever, but I'm not sure I buy it.
Okay. Well, I imagine this is not going to be the only time that we discuss this particular issue. Perhaps we need more information from Kant to roll in before we can do that. So let's just kind of keep going here. So on page 9, Kant calls these postulations here rational faith. And this is his definition of rational faith, at least in part, and I imagine it will be elaborated upon. Only a rational belief of faith is one grounded on no data other than those contained in pure reason. Okay? So let's read that again. Only a rational belief of faith is one grounded on no data other than those contained in pure reason. So I guess what we're saying here is that reason, pure reason, has a theoretical aspect and a practical aspect. The rational faith does not proceed from the theoretical aspect, but from the practical aspect, and that's how we get rational belief. Otherwise, we just have sort of a rational hypothesis that's sort of buoyed about, right? Now, this rational faith may be subjectively sufficient, right? But there is, for many reasons that we've already talked about, the fact that there is going to be no intuition of it is going to be objectively insufficient. So on one level, it will work, and on another level, it will work. And this rational faith is not knowing, okay?
Notice right before that, because there's this extended paragraph where he addresses the issue of Mendelssohn, and he critiques Mendelssohn from page 8 to 9, right before he defines rational faith. He critiques Mendelssohn and talks about Mendelssohn's issue of orientation. He says one of Mendelssohn's problems is he mistook the common sense element. He thought it was a cognition, but he says that he was actually thus it is not a cognition but a felt need of reason through which Mendelssohn, without knowing it, oriented himself in speculative reason. So notice that he's going back to Mendelssohn again. On the one hand, affirming Mendelssohn's love of reason, but saying he's kind of missed out. Like, Mendelssohn, this isn't a cognition. This idea of God isn't something you know. You're tapping into the felt need of reason, but you're not calling it that, and that's the downfall of your orientation method. Yeah. And then he goes on, right before he defines rational belief again, he says, since, however, in the question before us, the expression pronouncement of healthy reason always remains ambiguous and can always be taken either, as Mendelssohn himself understood it, for a judgment of rational insight, or, as the author of the results, Thomas Weisenman, appears to take it, for a judgment from rational inspiration. He says, then it will be necessary to give this source of judging another name, rational belief or faith. Yeah. So he's pointing out Thomas Weisenman's issue. He's saying, no, this isn't separate religious inspiration, which would lead to enthusiasm and potentially different crazy religious fanatics and enthusiasts if you say it's separate from reason. Nor is it a rational insight that you can know per Mendelssohn. This is where his contrast between those two comes out when he defines rational belief, like you said, no other data than from pure reason, but it's from the felt need of reason. And so again, he's contrasting himself to Wiseman and Mendelssohn, as we discussed in the previous podcast.
Right. So, I think an interesting thing that we need to ask ourselves is this difference, and we alluded to it in the introductory installment, is the difference between a rational hypothesis and a postulate. So, why? And I think this can be traced. I have a feeling it can be traced back to the theoretical and the practical needs of reason. It seems that they may issue from those separately. But he said, why is God not a hypothesis? And so we get a definition of pure rational hypothesis on page 10. A need of reason to be used in a way which satisfies it theoretically. Okay? Mm-hmm. Like, God is being introduced here not for theoretical concerns. We're not looking for an explanation of the universe, right? We're not looking here to, like, destroy, like, Richard Dawkins or something like that. Right. We're not trying to, like, slam some evolutionary biologist or something to that effect, right? We're not these intelligent design people. So, like, if we were interested in theoretical questions, but we're not interested in theoretical questions, we're interested in practical ones. So the question is, how is it different from a postulate? Why is God a postulate? And he says, rational faith rests on reason's practical intent. Therefore, a postulate of reason. But what's interesting, he says on page 10, a postulate of reason in comparison to a rational hypothesis is not inferior in degree to knowing, even though it is completely different from it in kind. So both rational hypothesis and postulates cannot be proven, right? Mm-hmm. They are needs of reason, but they are different species of. They come from different species of the needs of reason.
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah.
Right. And because the concept that they're both going after is something super sensible, it's not like an opinion that can be informed with further intuitions that can then become knowledge or something like that. Like, these will be on both levels. These will be forever sort of unknowable, right? Objectively, but subjectively, that's a different question. They might be sufficient for us to go about living our lives. Okay. What do you think? Think I'm getting it right?
I think you're getting it right.
Okay. So we talked about this earlier. The concept of God, all right, and it has to be cleansed by theoretical reason. It has to be purged of all sort of contradictions. Because the question is, like, well, what is this concept of God? Why wouldn't it be like a flying spaghetti monster or something like that? Well, presumably the flying spaghetti monster wouldn't be a viable candidate for God because it's got all sorts of contradictions bound up in it. And I don't need to necessarily go through what those are. I guess the most obvious one would be a flying spaghetti monster couldn't be a god because because it has embodiment and God necessarily is infinite, right?
Yeah.
So that wouldn't be a viable candidate for the rational concept of God.
Right.
How do you feel about that? You think that's a good enough take on that?
I think so.
Okay. So we may not be able to say what the rational concept of God is, but we can say definitely what it's not. Okay?
Right.
And because this rational concept of God comes first, right? We sort of extrapolate up from sensibility to concepts to this idea of there being this foundation of all being as the result of the need of reason and the need of practical reason. That's going to come first before any sort of historically revealed faith. Right. Like, that's going to inform us. That's going to inform us more so than anything else. And I would say I could probably draw on life experience from this. When I was a child, I think maybe the idea of there being an all-encompassing God made more sense to my childlike mind than Jesus Christ. And probably still does, to be honest. I actually, a lot of people become atheists because they say they can't believe in Jesus. Well, that's fine, but like, you're not really addressing the more fundamental thing, which is the rational concept of God, which seems to be within everyone, according to Kant. as a result of both the practical and the theoretical needs of reason.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was going to say you probably need to wrestle with... I mean, the problem with Kant... I forget where I read this, but Kant said something along the lines of... I think it's kind of this idea without God, without the idea of God, things don't make sense, they don't line up, they don't satisfy reason, basically, something along those lines. But that's why you have someone like Albert Camus saying, that's the absurd world we live in. So I think people need to wrestle with Kant's idea, but I think that the appeal to the practical, I think it's clever, I think it's good. I'm still wrestling with whether it's adequate to really address someone like Albert Camus' idea that we long for that type of rational satisfaction, but we might not actually get it.
Well, we'll have to see. It's going to be something that will haunt our entire discussion of Kant.
Now, this is interesting, though, because he goes into this area of using, from page 10 to 11, of this issue of the concept of God and the conviction of his existence can only be met within reason, and it can't come through inspiration or tidings communicated to us first. So then he talks about, I mean, he does a couple things. He talks about, it can't come from other authorities telling us what to believe. It can't come through a sense of inspiration or revelation. He then says, if I come across, so that's wise in men, and that's just church authority. But then he says, if I come across an immediate intuition of such a kind that nature, as I am acquainted with it, could not provide that intuition, then a concept of God must serve as a gauge whether this appearance agrees with all the characteristics required for a deity. So there are a couple things being dealt with here. I mean, he's dealing here with Jacobi. He's dealing with Wiseman. He's dealing with church authority. Saying that we need to gauge the rational concept of God against any intuition we feel, against any inspiration, against any revelation, against any church authority. So again, this is him throwing his hat into the ring of this conversation that's there. And in some ways, this applies. We were talking, I can't remember if we said this in part one, even in the book of Adler, for Kierkegaard, when Adler has his revelation that he receives from God, Kierkegaard says he needs to engage that, and he uses a lot of the same words, enthusiasm. He needs to engage that enthusiasm, that feeling, that experience against a Christian concept. He needs to enfold those into a Christian concept, because otherwise they're just scattered and crazy and everywhere.
Yeah.
So that was fascinating.
Yeah, I will. I think I will bring Kierkegaard in conversation with Kant. It's inevitable. I think for me, I'm trying to sort of just get clear on what Kant's trying to say first before I start doing any sort of comparison on it or whatever. Not to say that you're wrong to do that, but I think any sort of analogy that I can make right now might be premature, because this is really difficult stuff. And piggybacking on all of that, Kant closes out this section on orienting one's thinking about trying to address individuals, specifically geniuses, right?
Yeah.
That are anti-reason. He talks about how there are certain individuals who can have these great penetrating insights, and they seem to do it in spite of reason. And Kant saying, "Hey, listen, if you become an anti-rationalist in some sort, not only are you opening the doors to all this sort of cultish enthusiasm, nihilism, and atheism and stuff like that, but you're actually you might end up crushing your own ability to be a free thinker, to have that stroke of genius to begin with." And I thought that was kind of interesting. And he talks about that in three different senses, the freedom to think. And I wonder if it would be okay for me to kind of proceed into that, or did you have something else that you wanted to say first?
I have a comment on this first freedom, the first part of the freedom to think, that I think is particularly important. So he gives 3 things about the freedom to think, 3 points. So the first one is the freedom to think is opposed, first of all, to civil compulsion. So this is particularly important. And I'm getting some of this from Frederick Beiser's The Fate of Reason, Kant to Fichte. But I'm going to give a small quote from Beiser, page 118. that here Kant closes his essay with a stern warning to Jacobi and Wiesenman. They are undermining the very freedom necessary for their philosophy. In a few stirring lines, which are a direct response to Wiesenman's address to the young men of Germany, Kant begs them to consider this consequence of their irrationalism. Men of intellect and broad dispositions, those are Kant's words here in Religion Within the Bounds. I honor your talent and love your feeling for humanity, but have you thought where your attacks upon reason are heading? Surely you too want freedom of thought to be maintained inviolate, but without this, even the free fancies of your imagination will soon come to an end. So, this was... So at the time, Germany was being ruled by Frederick II, who had allowed a certain amount of liberal reforms, but his health was failing, and Kant is afraid at that point that his successor will come in and close down and censure freedom of expression, freedom of thought. And so there's real political issues that are involved, and I mean, because Kant's even thinking about things like the wars of religion, and like he's thinking about a lot of stuff here and saying, hey, look out, if you're not depending on reason, if you're depending on your personal inspiration or any of these things, like this could cause, it could cause society to dissolve, but it could also create political problems with us from the rulers who might shut down these great thought experiments that are happening right now.
Right.
So don't throw around fatalism, atheism, nihilism so haphazardly in your attacks against reason, because this could really backfire even on you.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'll be doing What is Enlightenment with Elizabeth Yang, and that's a much more public plea to make sure that doesn't happen. And what's interesting in this first sense of the freedom to think that you're talking about, how no civilian authority can suppress it, because the freedom to think is something that's completely contained within our person, but there are things that are very closely related to our ability to think, specifically the ability to have free speech like we have right now, as we try our hardest to understand what Kant's doing, and we communicate to a larger audience, and when they get the Noetic app and have these conversations in the discussion forums and things like that, and they go back to their home institutions and have these things, our freedom to think is bound up in our ability to communicate one another. And if we have political revolution like you're talking about that suppresses the ability to communicate and speak to one another, then in a way we lose our capacity to think for ourselves. Because you and I are able, I understand more about Kant now than I did an hour ago because I'm talking about it with you. If I had to just do it on my lonesome, if I didn't have this conversation with you and try to put it into words or whatever, I wouldn't nearly have the understanding I did than what's on my page in my notes. You know what I'm saying? I'm sure this is acting as a teaching device for other individuals, even though we may take a wrong step here and there as we figure it out. But I'm learning it in the conversation and becoming a freer thinker as a result of our conversation. But if the civil authority shuts that down, I become a less free thinker.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm being repetitious, so I should move on to the second thing. The second sense is that we can't really outsource. There's no compulsion of our conscience. I think you may have alluded to this already. We can't outsource this to leaders, religious leaders, or something like that. It has to be all ourselves. Perhaps the third sense is more interesting, and perhaps you've already covered it. My notes say here, if reason does not subject itself to its own laws, it will become subjected to the lawlessness of another. This is how free thought is trifled away. If reason does not rule, descend back into inspiration and superstition. And I thought maybe he was talking about, we'll see, but he seems to allude here, at least how I read him, that Christianity might be a form of superstition, but we have to see. I don't know. He's got a very difficult relationship with Christianity that I don't understand. But what he says about superstition is that it can be attractive because a lot of it has the form of law, right?
Yeah.
There aren't many laws in Christianity, but they're there. And there are some faiths where there's a lot more law, like say Judaism or Islam, and there is sort of a natural proclivity to drift towards those things when reason has been dethroned, because it has the form of law.
Yeah, and look at these definitions of enthusiasm and superstition. Enthusiasm is what those who have a more favorable view of it call illumination or revelation. This idea of like the Holy Spirit speaking to you and just giving you something, boom, now you know something. And
Yeah.
like enthusiasm and then superstition, that form of law. I love the specific definition of superstition, the subjection of reason to facts. Like, what do you think about that? Like to facts.
Well, it seems like he thinks that it should be that. So, I think probably what he sees is that. I think what he may find problematic is when you take like a fact like Christ, like the incarnation, and then build a rational system around like Christ as the Son of God or the Trinity or something like that, and then things get all sort of muddled. Rather, he's saying no, it's going to be reason, and then we sort of fit the faith in and around that. Like we judge the faith within these boundaries, like in anything that so. Maybe he can keep the idea of Christ being a moral prototype or the perfect example to be aspired to, but cut out the bit about him actually being a part of the Trinity. Like, for us to take the revelation of the incarnation of Christ as the starting point is to get the cart before the horse.
I wonder if there's
on his view. That's how I interpret it. Do you think it's a wrong or a right way to interpret him?
No, I was just going to give a different example. I think a good modern example would be the history of spiritualism in the U.S.
Yeah.
Because spiritualism, the roots of modern American spiritualism begin with the sound of knocking in a house in upstate New York. That's where it begins, this fact of these knocks. And then from that, you get this phenomenon of modern spiritualism.
Do you mean like Mormonism? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about like we're talking like ghost noises and
you mean like parlor tricks and stuff? I guess I'm not as familiar with American religion. So yeah.
So we're talking American spiritualism, like occultic spiritualism, that type of thing, like hauntings and stuff like that. Like it's
seances.
Yeah, sure. I mean, all that, like the American obsession with spiritualism. Modern American spiritualism starts with the fact of these knocks. Like that's the foundational story of American spiritualism. It starts from the sound of these knocks, and from that fact emerges this cultural phenomenon of spiritualism. Yeah. And all of its forms.
Yeah.
Maybe not all of its forms, but the phenomenon grows from there.
So, and in closing out this segment on orientation, Kant talks about how there are individuals, and we mentioned this earlier when we tried to delimit some of the terms, that individuals on purely speculative grounds, they don't want to give in to these needs of reason, can persist in rational unbelief, right? And they can be very dogmatic about it. He says this about page 13 of The Unbelief of Reason. First takes from moral laws so if we do this, first takes from moral laws all their force as incentives to the heart, and over time, all their authority and occasions this way of thinking one calls libertinism, the principle of recognizing no duty at all. That if we are going to be rigid in our atheism because we don't want to give in to these forces of reason, these needs of reason, these feelings of reason. I don't know quite how to talk about a need of reason. That we're going to descend into all this sort of chaos. That we actually have no reason to be moral whatsoever. And then what happens is that you have, like, the society starts to deteriorate, and then civil servants have to intervene and cobble together some sort of body politic, and then that ends up, because it's done out of expediency and efficiency, ultimately suppressing the freedom of thought. So on the one hand, he's reining in the enthusiasts and the spiritualists, on the other hand, reining in the atheists or whatever, so he can have like some sort of functioning state of free thinkers.
Well, yes, and it's interesting too, because going to that issue of libertinism, like this idea that the unbelief of reason, not recognizing reason's need for God, etc., takes away all the force of incentive from human hearts and minds. Yeah, like it takes away that, and then you end up, and that's where libertinism sets in. Like that's the call. I mean, you said that the authorities get involved because it breaks down, but it specifically breaks down because the force of those things are taken away when you don't recognize the need of reason. Yeah. And then you become a litigious society instead.
Yeah. All right, man. I think we did an okay job.
What do you think?
I think we did an okay job.
Talking to you.
I think we have a lot to learn, and I think what we know about this text will be refined, and I think the listeners are going on a journey with us. And I guess what I would say is when you guys get the Noetic app, where we make errors, feel free to correct us. And if you feel like you understand this text better than us, please contribute material.
This is like that on Conan O'Brien show where he's like, if you find an error, write to Team Coco / haha, I found an error, or whatever it's called.
But that's all part of the process. And I think
copyright Team Coco.
I think what I want to communicate here is, yes, Noetic is an educational tool, but we also want to encourage people to make mistakes, because the making the mistakes is like how we set forth on these ventures of philosophical thought to begin with. And I guess if we're going to have an enlightened citizenry, we have to have a citizenry that's not afraid to have these conversations in public and perhaps retract things. So, yeah.
Are you feeling self-conscious?
No, I think eventually we got to where we needed to be. But I think it was hard for us at first. But I think it's only going to get better.
Kant, I had a professor say, he was actually a Kant scholar. He said Kant is like beef jerky. You have to really chew it to get into the goodness.
I think we'll have a pretty superior understanding of it by the time we get to the end of the book. All right, guys, join us next week when we'll have the third installment ready for you. Probably 3 or 4. All right, see you.